Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Right to Read Initiative. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Elana Gordon, who teaches in Cicero, Illinois. And today we're going to talk about what she does in her classroom. And maybe we'll go back a little bit, talking about who you are as a teacher and how you got to where you are today. Just a brief review.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for having me on today. I just finished my 24th year of teaching. I have always been in the same district. I started out as a fifth, sixth grade intermediate teacher, and then after that, I was really interested in teaching kids how to read and learning more about that aspect, and so I went back to school and I got my master's and I became a literacy support teacher is what they called them in my district at the time. And that was like part-time intervention work and part-time working with teachers, co-teaching, modeling, things like that. And then after several years of that, our district moved into building literacy coaches at all of our buildings. And so we also adopted reading recovery at that time. And so if you wanted to move in that direction, those were your two choices. So I thought being a building literacy coach sounded really interesting and I wanted to continue learning. So I joined the program at National Louis University, and I went through coaching training, and I did that for about 10, 11 years at various schools around the district. And then after doing that for so long, I kept wondering, was I having an impact the same way I had when I worked with students directly? So I wanted to go back to working more directly with students. So I went back to working I became a reading interventionist again, and I've done that for the last 3 or 4 years.
Great. So right now you're being the literacy interventionist. What grades are you working with?
So my building is a pre-K through sixth grade building. Mostly the last few years, we've tackled kindergarten through fourth, fifth grade. I've had students up through there. Every now and then we're able to get to our sixth graders, but I feel like sometimes they get lost in the shuffle. But I've worked with all of those grade levels.
Wonderful. And how does the school year start off at your school typically?
Well, I mean, our district in the last 2 years has been shifting towards a more structured literacy approach. And so typically, in the past, kids have took their MAP test at the beginning of the year, to kind of see where they were at. We were a big balanced literacy district, and so we used the Fontes and Pinnell benchmark assessment system. And then we spent most, like the first month of school, maybe assessing students in that way and trying to figure out what their reading levels were and what groups they belonged in and things like that. And so interventionists would support that testing. And then we would, see kids we would push into classrooms and help with tier 1 instruction and provide small group instruction through guided reading. And then we would start pulling kids that needed intervention support, like tier 2 and tier 3. We just adopted a universal screener last year, so we started using that instead. And we also adopted more diagnostic assessments. So we were using the core phonics survey and the PAST screener, things like that for phonemic awareness. And so we still do a lot of assessing at the beginning of the year, but it's much more in tune with what skills students need to learn and where the gaps are, even for our intermediate students. And then we, through the MTSS process, we start, we spend half of our time probably pushing into classrooms, working with tier 1, instruction in a small group setting. We usually push in through we call it targeted instruction time, where it's like a 30-minute block of time that we had to work on skills that students had deficits in. And then our tier 2 and tier 3 students, we would pull out and work with them in a more specific framework, I guess you'd say.
Okay, so we're going to go into your journey on another episode.
Okay.
But would you say that you feel that you were able to get the professional development to support you in this role, or was a lot of it learning on the fly?
So I like if I rewind a couple of years, I felt like most of our professional development through most of my years in the district had been around balanced literacy. We do a lot of professional in-house development and also like, going to conferences and things. So like I had attended the Reading Recovery Conference in Chicago. I had gone to the Fontes and Pinnell, workshops that Heinemann put on, things like that. And we got a lot of in-house training. But I'd say that when we started making the shift, we had a new literacy director come on who had, knew about the science of reading, and he was very big into sharing the research behind everything. And so we spent that first year, that was about 2 years ago, we spent the year learning about the why. And so it wasn't just make these shifts because we're telling you to, it was really, understanding that we had kind of missed the research behind everything that has existed for decades, which shocked many of us. And so we began listening to podcasts and trying to have discussion groups around that. We formed a language arts committee that was tasked with piloting or picking some curriculums that we would pilot because we're trying to move towards a more knowledge building curriculum. And then we were offered the chance to be part of the letters training for teachers. So if you signed up to do that, you were put in different cohorts. And so interventionists actually got to be one of the first cohorts. So I just finished my letters training this past school year. So I'd say like
that's a big accomplishment while working.
Yeah, thank you. It was big, but it was very well supported. We had online trainings as cohorts, and then because we don't have classrooms and we don't need subs, which is a big problem in education right now, it was easier to pull us as that first cohort group. And we were able to learn that first year about some other frameworks and really think about the time that we had with students, that 30 minutes, and what we could really accomplish as opposed to trying to do everything in reading. And so I think before we weren't as focused and as explicit as we are now, and we really tried to change that. And then from that intervention group, it moved into, now trying to train teachers. And so teachers were brought in to be like the second and third cohorts. So, after that, I kind of fell into the rabbit hole of just taking it on myself. I really love learning about the research. I started going to symposiums in the summer. I've gone to a few big conferences in the area with some experts in the field. I've read a ton. So I think your district it needs to be supported, because I certainly did not get this in my teacher ed program. I came out not really knowing how to help kids learn to read, which is what gave me that interest in wanting to help them and learn more. So I'd say I think you read a lot of stories in the media now about all those districts that, they just want to put changes in place, and it doesn't work like that. I think without the why and the understanding, you really don't know the ins and outs, and you can't get better at what you're doing if you don't know why you're doing it. And so I think we're on the right track. I think we have a long way to go. I think because I was an intermediate teacher, I understand how hard that learning is for teachers who have never had this before. They've never really had to teach their kids foundational skills. And we're finding our, 3rd through 6th grade students have a lot of gaps that we weren't addressing the needs. And so we still have a lot more learning to go. And, as we go through Scarborough's strands of, the rope and the different strands, we've spent a lot of time on foundational skills, and we're trying to move ourselves along through, really threading our PD around comprehension and what does that look like in our classroom, and then we adopted CKLA from Amplify. And so really thinking about what that looks like in the classroom. And, now when teachers see that curriculum, it's not just following a curriculum, it's more about, oh, I know why we're including phonemic awareness now, and we didn't do that before. Or I know why I need to be explicit, and it's not asking students questions about it's telling them what that, what that phonics skill is. So I think that we're trying to go about it the right way. And of course, we have a ways to go like everybody else.
Right. So for you, that's amazing that you guys are doing this work. Thank you so much for all the students that you're touching. And all the ones you'll touch in the future, because reading is, Pam Snow shared an article today on Twitter about how it's a moral responsibility and a public health issue. And it really is when we think about it. So you were saying that you guys basically employ an MTSS model, so a multi-tiered system of support. At the beginning, you're doing the screening, and you said that you play an active role in that. So does this mean that you push into the classrooms and help the teacher screen, or are you providing support while the teacher screens themselves?
We've done both in the past. Currently, I think we're doing more of actual screening ourselves. So we just all went through training of Amplified users or CKLA uses M-Class and M-Class Lectora. We have a high population of second language learners and multilingual learners. And so we have dual language classrooms as well. And so we just also went through that training. I think interventionists, because they have more experience, they might be doing some of the more challenging subtests, and then the teachers will be doing some of like the letter sound ID and things like that are a little bit faster. So it's a shared responsibility now.
That's great. So once you have all this data, what do you do with it?
So usually our building teams, we meet across grade levels, and then we determine, where is it looking like in our buildings that we have the most need. I think there's a big debate going on. Do we start with the little ones and catch the problem early, like that, prevention instead of intervention, or do we, that guilt that we haven't, those older students, our intermediate, secondary, students have fallen through the cracks, and we owe them, like you said, it's a bigger problem than just teaching. Like it impacts their lives. And so thinking about like which students can we help with the amount of intervention and classroom teachers we have. Last year we tried a walking model where interventionists became part of a grade level, and so that team now just had 4 more people, and so they could split up kids more efficiently. And so those are the kinds of conversations I guess we have as a team. And then we, kids who have been in tier 3 already, we'll take a second look at them. Where do they fall based on the universal screening? Is that still true that they are falling, in the red more than other kids? And so we'll start with those kids too sometimes, and then build our groups from there.
Okay, that's awesome. So you said that you do push in and pull out. So what does a push in lesson look for you in the classroom? Are you doing the tier 1, the whole class, or doing that smaller group support?
Typically it's been the smaller group. Yeah, it's been the smaller group support. We've done like I said, last year we had that targeted instruction time, so we could push in during that time where teachers would be pulling some small groups and we would be pulling some small groups. I think in the way past during balanced literacy, I did more of supporting with whole class instruction, and certainly we can do that, but I think we spend more of our time now with that targeted instruction piece and pulling small groups while teachers are pulling small groups. So I guess the framework that I use for interventions is very similar to the classroom, although it maybe feels like a little less time, and there's of course a lot more going on around you. So there's a lot more, moving pieces and life happening in the classroom, but the framework itself pretty much remains the same.
Mm-hmm. So are your groups static or are they dynamic?
Well, I'd have to say right now they're pretty fluid these days. In the past we used to call them lifers, right? Like kids would come to us and they would not be moving, like they'd be at a level C and we just couldn't, they'd get to a D or they'd fall back and you just couldn't move them. And these days I feel like when I work with classroom teachers, my intervention groups even are very fluid. A student catches up in a month because they've had this targeted instruction, and I send them back and she says, these 2 students have kind of fallen behind. They're not remembering skills, or they need a little more fluency work, and we switch kids all the time. So I feel like that's happening more and more, which is the place we always wanted to get to and never could before. So I think we're moving in the right direction.
Awesome. So it sounds like you're doing some progress monitoring along the way to make sure that kids are getting what they need.
Yeah, our district used FastBridge for tiered intervention. We used CBM through FastBridge, like letter sound ID, nonsense word reading, We did oral reading fluency, but I don't think we ever looked at them diagnostically. Like we were just like, oh, are they making progress? Is their rate improving? But we weren't really looking at their accuracy, or, is it, was it a decoding issue? Was it a fluency issue? Was it a comprehension issue? And we never asked the comprehension questions when we used them. So we really didn't even know that piece. I think we had parts like everyone else. We had pieces. We just didn't know the why too. So like we weren't using them effectively. And so now we're moving away from FastBridge. We're using everything that comes in the suite of assessments through Amplify, through MClass. So we'll be using, CBMs through there, similar. And there is a dyslexia screener within there too, which I'm really excited about, because I think in the past we have not addressed, dyslexia at all. We've just kind of skated by and just, kids were getting lost. And now we have a way to identify them, more accurately.
Of course. Well, that sounds, again, great. So what are you doing in these groups? Are you saying, okay, this is what we're doing, this is our program, something like LLI, like level literacy interventions, or having a set, or do you adapt to the students' needs?
So I think the last 2 years the district created a word recognition framework, and it was more built through like the components where we started with phonemic awareness. I've since added more cumulative review because I feel like the kids need that. And then I go back to phonemic awareness where I tie it more to the skill that we're going to be working on. And then we have a encoding and decoding piece of it. And then we end with like a quick phonemic awareness, activity. So that's my intervention framework. We try to use that in the class too, but it doesn't, sometimes it's a little bit of shorter. So it might take, like, this is like a more of a 3-4 day intervention framework. Moving forward, since we have adopted a curriculum, we're going to be following their MClass interventions is what it's called. So there's MClass and MClass Lectura assessments for teachers. And then there are some suggested and recommended activities they can do. And then interventionists for tier 2 and tier 3 students will be using MClass interventions and following. Those lessons are called burst lessons. And so they have a little bit of everything in them too, but I'm not as experienced. We haven't really received training yet. So I'm kind of eager to see what that looks like. It's a little more scripted than in the last 2 years. I've designed my own lessons to fit this framework with resources either provided to me or ones I found. And now we have a set curriculum where I'll be following the lessons from these burst lessons. So that's a big difference for me too. I really enjoy all the learning I've done and putting my theory into practice. And so this will be a new experience for me this year.
Now, how do you feel? So a big thing where I am is the importance of teacher autonomy. And do you feel that this training and this way of going about making sure that all students have access to reading instruction, that you are losing autonomy?
Not in that sense. I mean, at first I felt like, why do I have to read a scripted lesson? Or why do I have to follow that exactly? Because I've created my own lessons and I've had a lot of success. I've seen lots of students who have never learned to read in 3rd grade, all of a sudden they're reading, and I've seen a lot of kids grow, and that's been shown on the universal screener this year. And so at first I was kind of annoyed, like, why do I have to do this, but I understand why we need to make it, the same. Every student deserves the same, that same chance to have, that skill set and the same experience when they go from classroom to classroom. So I feel like it covers that aspect. And, and then I also think that that's where I need to learn, yes, it's a scripted lesson, but how do I put my own teacher spin on it? Because I think teachers are doing that every day. And so that term, the science of teaching, right? There's a science of reading and a science of teaching, and this is where they come together. And so I'm going to have to find my way of how do I put that into the lessons that are already given to me. So that's what I guess I'm eager to see myself. It'll be a new learning experience, but I have enjoyed creating my own, because I think when you do the work and you understand the work more deeply, I think that these lessons are far easier for me to understand and plan than guided reading ever was. I never really knew what we were supposed to be getting out of it, or how did I identify if a student had learned all the skills in level E to move to an F. It still was very confusing and vague. And I feel like this is much more concrete to me.
That's great. And I think, when you get these scripted lessons, especially when you're just learning a program, it's useful so you understand and recognize what you're supposed to do. I remember working as a research assistant with a project that had great resources and everything, but teachers weren't exactly sure how to use them based on how they were designed, and use them as more of a discovery-based tool instead of an explicit instruction tool. And it didn't have the same success rate. But then, as you get more familiar with the program and are able to recognize the task, it's not like you're expected to say word for word to script, have it memorized. It's giving you a launching point, but it's providing the continuity between classrooms across the school and allowing you to know that it doesn't matter which class they're in, and also giving the next year's teachers the understanding, okay, well, this is what we've covered.
Yeah.
And knowing, when you're doing your screening assessment to figure out more diagnostic what the skills the students are missing, okay, well, they're missing this grapheme, phoneme, correspondence. We just have to go back to this lesson and review it.
Yeah, I think that idea of leveling the playing field and everybody having the same language is really important, because otherwise, how do you, at these MTSS meetings or problem solving meetings, how do we talk to each other about the kids that, that we're instructing? So I think that I would agree. I mean, I think that there's this definitely necessary place for that.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the strategies that you like employing, and what are you doing with these kids when you're working with them?
Yeah, well, I'm excited to share. I love learning about other people's classrooms. So I hope some of these tips are helpful. I was thinking I would just kind of walk everyone through the framework and just share some resources that I use day to day or week to week.
I think that would be great. But just, would you think we'd be better talking about what you do for pull out for the tier 3? Because we talked a lot about push in. Do you want to talk more when the pull out, or do you want to go through what you're actually using first?
Oh yeah, this is for the pull out. Is that okay?
That's totally fine. It's just we hadn't talked about it yet, so I don't. It's totally up to you whether you want to talk about the whole pull out process, what you do, whether you're telling a couple students, one student, or does it vary based on student need?
Yeah, so it varies based on student needs. I've had a few tier 3 students that are we generally have said if students are 2 years or below where they should be at that grade level, especially in our intermediate grades where they've missed a lot of this foundational skill instruction, those kids have become tier 3 students pretty quickly because we recognize that gap. Other students, a lot of students are tier 2 students, which is in our district, we moved towards the teachers are also tier 2 teachers. So that's how we became like that walking model. So they're teaching kids that we would consider tier 2 in small groups, but so are we, even though we might pull them out just to kind of get a different setting. The framework, like I said, really stays the same, even between my tier 2 and my tier 3 students. It's just kind of, working with a child and seeing their specific needs, whether they need more fluency. So I had, for example, a group of students that were tier 2 students, and some of the teachers thought that some of the students needed IEPs or needed a tier 3. And what we found was while they were making progress, they just needed more repetitions. And, things like that, working with specific cases made me really want to understand, like, was there something different that our tier 3 students needed, or was it more of the same, more of that good instruction? And so, I started reading research last summer, lots of articles and things about, research and meta-analysis and things like that about like what is the difference. And so I read a lot about the SIPS program, which seems to be very successful, but that's not what we have. So basically what I found through all that research was that those students just need more of the same. They needed to be extremely explicit, but they need tons more repetitions. And I know I've attended some webinars with Jan Hasbrook and some other people where they say, Angie Hanlon, I think, says this too, that some kids will need 10 repetitions, some need 50, some need 200. And I found with my specific cases, that really was what I was finding, that when we could layer, like they came to me for an intervention time frame, like a word recognition framework for 30 minutes, but then we could find 15 more minutes in the day to do fluency work with them, that's when those kids really like started to make more gains, and they were able to catch their class because they just needed that extra practice and they needed it more often. And so we have found that we do the same framework right now for our tier 2 and our tier 3 students.
That's great. So let's see some of those materials that you're using and strategies that you find.
I think resources are my favorite part. So I'd say, so we start with phonemic awareness. I think what I started with was the 1-minute activities from Equip for Success. You take the past screener from David Kilpatrick, and then it tells you where to start. I really like that because it moves through like syllable and word level work, and then really moves to that phoneme level. But what I noticed after doing that for the first year was that it wasn't exactly tied to my phonics skill. And I also wanted some phonemic awareness tied to my phonics skill. So I would go into my my cumulative review and then touch back on like a phonemic awareness activity before teaching the phonics piece of the skill. So what I really liked is 2 or 3 summers ago, we read A Fresh Look at Phonics by Wiley Blevins. Mm-hmm. And I think that book is really practical for teachers. It's got great recommendations and things that you can implement right away. So one of the things he does is called blending lines. And I tried to print this, probably is too small for anyone to see, but the website, The Measured Mom, took his work and she put it into like an editable form. So I'll just tell you, basically, I do this on a big dry erase easel. So we do this quickly when kids are coming in as the review. But line 1, you know, you take whatever sound. And so let's say you're working on short U, you might have cup, pup, sup, but, cut. So you're changing that initial sound only, and it's all in just one line. So that's line 1, and kids are reading that. And then line 2, he makes suggestions, like you would vary the initial sound with groups of words. So maybe 3 words go together, like pot, hot, tot, and you're just changing the first sound, and the next 3 words is mob, rob, sob. So you're changing that first sound in those 3 words. Line 3 is changing the final sound of the word. Line 4, he talks about having a mixed set of the focus skill. So that might be like if you're working on long A, so it's an AI word, it might be mail or chain or rain or praise. So it's a mix of words. Line 5 is, and 6 are review skills. And that's where like we bringing back what we learned a few days ago or last week, so that kids are always getting that practice in. And I think that's really important, especially for students who are in these tiers. They might not have, consolidated all of their learning when you were, they showed that they were ready to move on, but they still need that review. So this really helps with that piece. And then line 7 is usually some challenge words. And I really like this because it helps with my intermediate students. So I show them how a syllable type works in a 1-syllable word. And then how do we use that to read a 2-syllable word or a 3-syllable word? So that's where that challenge line comes in. And then, so if they've learned like silent E, and then they've learned a vowel team like team, and then that line might have teammate. And so now they've read, a multisyllabic word. And so we do a lot of work with that, especially with my older students, because they need to accelerate their learning. And then lines 8 and 9 are more put into context, like it's a sentence, and it might be a sentence from the decodable you're reading. It might just be a sentence that, you made up that has that skill. So in his book, there's a page that describes all of that. I don't know what page it's on, but also themeasuredmom.com. If you go there, you can find her editable page, and I've never used it. I just found it while I was trying to search for the resources, and I think it's great. I think it's really helpful. This is also, I do it on my dry erase easel, like a big easel, and we do it all together. The kids are all reading it like quietly, and I'm listening, and then we all choral read it. And then sometimes I'll have certain kids do certain lines so that I can kind of tell on the spot what's happening, like who starts to kind of, get quiet as we get to those multisyllabic words. And then I know like that student needs more support. And also by chorally reading it, and they're all reading it not silently, but quietly, they're getting more repetitions in as well. And then I like her form because you could send it home and they can also practice it that way. So that's kind of nice. So that's
the name of the book again, please.
Oh, sure. A Fresh Look at Phonics by Wiley Blevins.
All right. Yeah. So that's a fresh look at phonics. Sorry, I'll try and put it in the show notes.
Oh, great. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a really one of the most practical books I read.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's I like to do that for review often. So that's typically my go-to. I find it really successful with students, and it's, very structured. And so they know what to expect. And then just some other things that I found were very helpful was when we started shifting, we also were given this resource. I know you've talked about it on here before. It's from Kidlips, or Tools for Reading. It's that articulation piece. So, which blew me away when I was letters training. It's like Unit 2, and I had never heard of articulation, or things that our speech language teachers, pathologists did, and I couldn't believe how much was missing from my instruction, by not having that piece, being able to talk to students about what your mouth is doing, and voiced and unvoiced. I haven't often practiced and thought like my voice wasn't working, but like, we did little tricks, like when it's a B and a P, if kids were, interchanging them or not making the correct sound, like holding a Kleenex in front of you for the P, that puff of air pushes it, and they can visually see that when you say the B sound, it doesn't do that. And so little things like that, I think, also interest our kids. Like, they're very interested in, those facts, right? They grab onto them. And so that Kidlips has, or it's called Kidlips, but it's from Tools for Reading. They have a whole articulation binder, I guess you'd say, and it gives you lots of things to do in phonemic awareness. It tells you how to put up your sound wall, which is another shift that we made, going from word walls to sound walls, which makes perfect sense. Why would the word she ever go under S? But, like things like that, we just weren't aware of. And so we've made shifts like that. And I've added little microphones to my sound wall. And so what sounds that have your voice on, we put a little microphone by, so they can visually see that. I found that that's been helpful. And then I try to work with,
So I was just going to say that, you mentioned that you're in a school where there's lots of English language learners and multi-language learners. And the important thing, especially when we're talking about this phonemic awareness piece, is recognizing that the phonemes of English may not necessarily be part of their first language, and their first language may have ones that we don't have, and having that awareness of the difference between the two and allowing them, especially in those early years where their brains are still capable of learning the phonemes to a point where it sounds like they're a native speaker, right? Especially in those early years of schooling. This is where we are explicitly drawing their attention to the letter sound, or sorry, the phonemes and the articulatory gestures can really help. And I've worked with students where their articulation and the gestures that they're using to make the sound are completely wrong. Yeah. And recognizing that, there's some kids that just don't get it and don't understand how to make those sounds and where they're coming from.
Yeah, and I think too, acknowledging, even my intermediate students who are second language learners and they speak Spanish at home, and then they come to school and they're very fluent in English, but sometimes they still had trouble with vowel sounds. And instead of saying like, why would you be making that ah sound for the ah sound? Like, well, to them, their vowels, make a very specific sound, and it's one sound. In English, it makes all these different sounds. And so that's a big aha. And recognizing to them, like, you're right, in your dominant language or your home language, that is what that would sound like. But in English, remember, what does this vowel sound, sound like, and so I think like pointing out those cross-linguistic differences, those similarities, and then addressing the differences is really important. And I think all of that learning came around thinking about sound walls and articulation, and going through letters training really helped. But our district also had some PD around that as well, so that was nice. So I love my Kidlips binder. That first year, like you said, I was learning, I had to have it in front of me. And the nice thing is, it doesn't do this for every language, but for Spanish, there is a section of these are what your Spanish speakers would know with this phoneme or this sound. And so this is what you might need to point out, and it gives you examples, and it gives you words to say out loud to them, and have them listen, like thumbs up, do you hear it? Thumbs down, you don't. So we do a lot of that too.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. And it's going to help them with their spelling. And one thing that I think is not talked about as much, especially when we're talking about the science of reading, is the fact that when we look at their spelling, you can recognize what they are hearing.
Absolutely.
Why they're making these errors. And sometimes when you look at spelling, whether it's a writing sample or a spelling test, you're like, how on earth did they come up with those sounds? But when you have a better understanding of the phonemic awareness and the sounds in their first language or their, home languages, you have a better understanding of why they are making those errors. And then they're easier to fix than just saying, well, this is how it's spelled. Yeah. Oh, you're not recognizing that Kate and gate are different because one's voiced and one's unvoiced. So let's say it, feel your voice box.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the word father. I remember in my past, right, I saw a lot of FAD, instead of TH, because that's not a similar sound. And so, pointing out now I understand, like, why was their spelling like that versus just saying like, oh, what were they thinking, or I can't understand how to even read that. Or, I think like that puts the onus back on us to understand as teachers, the students in front of us. I think that's extremely important. Mm-hmm. And then I was also going to add that UFLI, which I know a lot of people too have talked about. I think University of Florida Literacy Institute, their website offers a lot of free resources, and beyond their decodables, which are amazing, which I'll also talk about, they do individual sound walls. They have many individual sound walls that students can put like in a little folder or have in front of them. And I find that since our intermediate students, their classrooms don't always have those same, like K2 typically has a sound wall up, and intermediate classes by us at least don't. So this is a nice place for students to be able to still have it, and it's easy to use, but it's their own little version of it. So that's also printable and free from their website.
Well, and for some students, just having that thing that they can reference makes a huge difference, because they haven't reached automaticity. They recognize the sound, and especially when we're talking about phonemes that have multiple grapheme representations, right? Like the sounds of A. Well, yeah. There's lots to go through, and talking about the most common sounds of the word or the phoneme A, but you're not typically going to have just the grapheme A at the end of a word saying A, right? So if you teach them those tips and tricks about the language, that's where you're able to demystify, the pronunciation of words and how to spell them, because reading is not an isolated skill. It's highly related to writing.
Yeah, and I know that you've said, I was studying up on some of your podcasts. I know that you've talked about the Uncovering the Logic of English as a great resource for that. And there's some other ones, like I like Phonics and Spelling Through Phoneme Grapheme Mapping. It's like a spiral bound book. That one's also really great. But Uncovering the Logic of English is a popular one by us too. I think it's a lot of ahas for all of us who either reading was easy or we just never, learned that stuff to teach. And so it gives you a lot of insight, like you said, into the why. And I think, kids learning that English words don't end in V, things like that. Like, it's just interesting to them. They grasp onto it and they want to know the etymology of words. It's kind of cool that they know these facts. So I think, like you said, that's important for them to know. So I think that...
Wait, can I just jump in for a sec?
Yeah.
The reason why I mentioned the logic of English so much is it's a great starting place, right? Because it's only a 4-hour read. It's fairly easily digestible, and it gives you some of that quick reference. I mean, another one that I like is the ABCs and All the Tricks.
Oh, I haven't read that one.
One that has a lot more of a quick reference.
Okay.
The different graphemes. And it's able to give you more information. What's her name? There's a big individual who's very passionate about Gina Cook from the Linguistic Educator Exchange. She has some amazing resources especially with those high frequency words that aren't necessarily obviously decodable. She goes into the etymology, and the cards are absolutely amazing and full of great resources, even if you just flip through yourself in the evening or when you have a spare minute. And it's a great reference tool to just have, because it's a lot of knowledge to gain right off the bat. So anything that we can use, not as a cheat, but as a help along the way, is always appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope you put that one in the show notes for me.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, other than that, I use what I have around me. We tap out words, we listen for beginning, middle, ending sounds. We use unifix cubes because I just went to a teacher and borrowed her math manipulatives, and so those are what I use a lot of. And, it doesn't have to be super fancy or, things like that. We tap out on sound boxes, which I know Econium boxes you've talked about before on the show. So we do a lot of, segmenting and blending and, substitution and things like that, because we realized how much our kids had not gotten that. So that's pretty much where that phonemic awareness part comes in. And then I try to tie that to, the skill that we're working on. So if we're working on a certain vowel sound, and I try to add letters as much as I can, as quickly as I can. So, they might have all the different vowels in front of them on little tiles, like laminated tile cards. And, if I'm saying a word and they have to identify what vowel sound did they hear, and they pick up that tile. So kind of, introducing some of those graphemes as well along the way. I do want to shout out this one. I don't know if you've seen this. I'll hold it up. This is ridiculous. It's called Teaching Phoneme Awareness in 2022, a guide for educators. It came out a year ago and it was some David Kilpatrick is on here, Louisa Motes is on here, but there's some other researchers on here as well. And it was just kind of like a handbook, like a mini handbook for educators. And what I liked about it was it gave some of the why at the beginning, but then it also goes through some very descriptive examples of sound chaining and blending and segmenting, and why that's important and what you can do, and kind of like how you build from the ground up, and that you don't have to, students aren't mastering one thing before you're moving to the next in phonemic awareness necessarily. But and it gives some routines and some examples. So I thought it's like 20 some pages. Yeah. And so I thought that was very manageable for teachers to have as a resource. So I liked that. I shared that with some teachers at my school. Okay, so then I think I'll move into the phonics portion, which is kind of both that decoding and encoding. Just as another quick review, like I have a deck of cards, and this can be as little as individual letter sounds, but it could also be like R controlled vowels. It can be vowel teams, things like that. So we flip through a deck of cards and we say the sounds, and it's just like a quick 1-minute review. That's very easy. I talked about the laminated letter tiles. So I have sound mats that I actually took from a guided reading kit, but it has sound boxes and different, like a 2, 3, 4, 5 sound boxes, and it's in a sleeve, which is great because you can reuse it. And that's where we tap out and write words, and we do sound, we do sound letter dictation, word dictation. We have dry erase boards that have like the handwriting lines on them. So we do a lot of letter formation work on there. For my older students that might have more sounds in a word, we have this. This comes from the letters manual. It's kind of like an older version of a sound mat. And then I use the letter tiles. It's just simply like cut up, letter tiles that were laminated. Since then, we've ordered some magnetic ones for kids, like sound mats, and for teachers. So I think we've got ours from Really Good Stuff has them, and Ascend Learning. That's one that probably a lot of people haven't heard about. Ascend Learning has a lot of great phonics games. Like you can play War. And it's got the numbers that you use for the regular type of war card game, but you also have whatever skill words that follow a skill, and kids have to read their word and then they look at the numbers. So it's a good game for classroom teachers, I think, like when kids are not in a small group or they're not working on something else and you teach them how to do this, that's a good one. And so I use my letter tiles as like a scaffold. So kids were word building on their mats. So if we said cat and they're building the word cat, I might give them several tiles, including those letters, but some other ones. And then they're manipulating those. And then eventually we kind of remove the tiles and they're doing the writing of those letters. So it's kind of a built-in support that way. We do some work with alphabet arc mats, which I tried to print, but they kind of came out crazy. So I'm sure it's just the alphabet kind of like in a rainbow shape. And you can do a lot of sequencing work with that. You can do a lot of blending work with that, things like that. Let's see. So then when we're ready to, we've introduced the skill and things like whatever new phonics skill, we move into word lists. And so I really like the word lists from Spire. I was able to get a hold of the Spire curriculum, and they move from word lists to sentences to decodable texts. And so I really like that movement because I feel like it's a good scaffold for kids and lots of repetition. I always have kids underline the part of the skill the part of the word that we're working on. So it's a vowel team, they'll underline it so their eyes are drawn to it. And then like as the week goes on, as lessons go on, we kind of give them a clean copy so that that scaffold is kind of, removed if, it's not there forever, because we're not always writing on all the books that we read. So I like Spire's word list, but also these two websites are really fabulous. Dyslexiclogic.com. They already have pre-done word lists for word chaining or for under different skills. You can just print out the word list and it's perfect. And then phonicswordlist.com. It's got a menu and you just choose, are you working on CVC words? Are you working on multisyllabic words? Our controlled vowel words, and then you put how many words you'd like and it creates your list for you and you can just print it. So those are some really good, easy, quick resources. And then, then I usually move to sentences too. So sometimes I usually like to create my own. So I'll move from the word list to sentences, and we do the same thing. We practice that for repetition, and then we move into decodable texts. And so I think my favorites are phonic books for older readers, especially. They do a really good job of doing a lot of work around fantasy and magic and just really interesting. They're chapter books as well. They have some of the other stuff. They have like the Dandelion series, which is for younger kids, and the Launchers, but they have the older books that look more intermediate appropriate, and my intermediate students love them. They'll take them and read them and do work at home as well, and they're chapter books, so you can pace it out whatever time you have. Core Knowledge has free resources and decodable text that I really like. And then UFLI is another one. I find myself using their work a lot. And then, of course, I found Spire books to be pretty good too.
Wonderful. So you've got a great resource library and know to work with other ones. And I think what we'll do is have whatever you're willing to share. Maybe we'll work on a PDF to include in the show notes so people can have access to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love, like I said, I love the resource part. So I'd say this is a tip that I learned for fluency practice, because I do a lot of work, like kids are chorally reading or echo reading or partner reading. And so I'm not sure whose webinar it was, but they did a whole thing on, because you're giving corrective feedback to a pair or a student, a good way to have kids independently practice is just give them colored counters or chips. And so my kids get 3 in front of them. So let's say we're on a word list, they have to read that word list 3 times. So they read through the whole list and then they flip a counter. And so they're doing that and it keeps them accountable and engaged while I'm maybe helping somebody else. So I found that was like a little tiny tip that was really helpful this year. I really do like partner reading and paragraph shrinking. I think even with decodable text, that's really important for that fluency practice and also comprehension. I went to a webinar with Lindsay Kemeny, who's an educator, I think out of Utah, and she created these like posters that, talks about ask then tell. So how to tell your partner when they made a mistake. She has paragraph shrinking for like, it looks like this for younger kids, you know, and then it kind of can look like this for older kids. So she talks about, you know, what each partner does, and it's like 5 simple steps. And so those are really helpful. So like teaching that routine to my students. And then when it's time to read that decodable text, that's kind of how we work. That's been really helpful. And then the paragraph shrinking part is after every paragraph, every new paragraph, they stop and they're telling their partner the major who or what in the story, or the text, and then a little bit about why. And so that's just kind of bringing that comprehension piece into a very small amount of time that I have to work with students. So that kind of rounds out like that phonics decoding, encoding piece of it. For the encoding, we do a lot of like tap it, map it, graph it, and we do a lot of dictation work. So, and we do a lot of syllable work too, like splitting up syllables and learning syllable types, but not exhaustively, just enough so students are understanding what they're seeing in a word and how to break it up. I think that was my biggest question back when I was a classroom teacher a long time ago, was I didn't have strategies. Like, what did I tell these kids? Like, how do I break up these, you know, words? Just look for the word part didn't really seem very helpful at the time. So that's been kind of a game changer as well. And then I know a lot of people think like vocabulary and comprehension doesn't really fit into these foundational skills or decodable texts, which is what we thought back in the day. I remember in our district, we used to throw them out. They didn't make sense. They didn't have a story. They were, what was going on here? And so since then, I've attended a lot by Wiley Blevins, and he does a lot of work with layering decodable text, like layering your instruction. And I think he calls it like a springboard. So I know everyone probably knows how important tier 2 words are, and, you know, their transferability. And so that's what we're getting our kids to want to, you know, to learn more about. And so like if we're reading a decodable text on frogs, let's say, he would say, pick out a word like habitat. And even though that's not in the decodable text, it's a tier 2 word that is a springboard for discussion and digging deeper. And so we usually use, I like the routine from letters for vocabulary. It's like a 5-step routine where, and I could send that to you, like it's, they have it laid out. You say the word, you talk about the syllables in it, you talk about the phonemes, the morphemes, the spelling, the part of speech, like you said, the etymology of it, and then you give a student-friendly definition, and then you give like examples of, you know, using that word, and then non-examples as well, and students can say yes or no, does that showcase that word? And then the students are using that word in their language, and they're coming up with sentences or other examples, or, you know, within partners, they could even be doing that. So I like to use that with whatever tier 2 word I've introduced. And then throughout the week, as we're going back to this text, we'll use that word within the sentences that we're writing, or we'll use it in our discussion, like make sure you're using the word habitat when you talk about this text. So I like that. Some other really quick ones are Academic Word Finder from Achieve the Core. There's where you can scan in a text, and then it will pull out the tier 2 words. So if that's not your strong suit and you need a little help or support, it does it for you. And then you can decide which of those words you might want to teach. And then speechtherapystore.com also has tier 2 words by grade level, which I don't know if everybody would agree with that, but it's really nice because you can kind of, if you're stuck for some of these words, you can have a place to go for certain grade levels and pull out words. So those are 2 really nice places. So we do a lot of vocabulary mapping, like mapping words and how are they related to each other. And I'd say even on the basic level, because like we talked about, we have a lot of second language learners, even words like bat, right? There's all different ways we can think about the word bat. And so making sure that they have an understanding that words can hold more than one meaning. So that's how we use vocabulary. And then ending with comprehension, I like to use, again, Wiley Blevins has 5 questions, and I think they're also in that book, A Fresh Look at Phonics, or he has another book using using something in decodable texts. Mm-hmm. And so he has like a lesson planner in there, and his 5 questions, like these are the 5 questions he sticks to. The first one talks about, the answer has a word that follows the skill that you're learning. in it, so that they're practicing that skill. The second one is finding a specific detail and supporting it with evidence. So kids, even at these levels, are getting that practice. The third one and fourth one is a higher level question or an inferencing question. And then the fifth one is related to the students' lives. And by no means do I get to all of them all the time. So I usually pick out, 2 or 3 that work for that text. I attended the Writing Revolution is a writing book by Judith Hochman and Natalie Wexler. And I attended their writing, it wasn't an institute, it was like a class. And so I read their book, and I really think that it was very eye-opening, because we had previously in my district used Units of Study by Lucy Calkins, which is a writing workshop approach. And we just found that was not a good match for our students. And even though we knew that, we weren't doing anything different. We just kept doing it and saying how we didn't like it, but we weren't helping students. And so I really like the sentence level work that the Writing Revolution works on. It talks a lot about how to combine sentences, how to identify fragments and run-ons, how to use because, but, so sentences. And there's, all of that is in her book. And so for our comprehension, we do a lot of writing about the decodable text. And we try to use some of that sentence level work, like sentence expansion boxes. They come up with a simple sentence and we expand it with the who and the what and the when, those WH questions, and then put it all together. Or are there 2 simple sentences that we could combine to make a more complex sentence? And so I think, even though interventions has a shorter amount of time, and there's a certain framework to work within, and maybe that isn't your main goal, but like you said, writing and reading are so reciprocal that even finding different ways to layer in some of these other pieces that classroom teachers get more of a chance to do, I think is really helpful, because then our kids who are even struggling the most get an opportunity to practice those things more often. And then I always end with a phonemic awareness. I think I go back to the 1-minute activities from Equip for Success, because they're just quick and easy. And we call them our listening games or listening time activity. And then that's it. So that kind of rounds out the whole framework.
Wonderful. You've got great resources, and I can't wait to look through the reference list that we're going to have available for listeners to just see some of these great resources that you've mentioned. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.